Hello and welcome to True Audio Files. Thank you for joining. I want to talk about the Sex Pistols. Never mind the Bollocks, it's the Sex Pistols. Or here's the Sex Pistols, I should say. And the biggest reason for talking about that is Rhino High Fidelity just released their version of this on 180 gram vinyl cut from the original analog master tapes by Kevin Gray in a gatefold that has the inner sleeve in the gatefold, and this particular one is a numbered version. I know that they're going to come out with a non-numbered version probably soon, but this is the numbered version that's available right now. It looks like it's still currently available, and I'm going to do a comparison between that version, and I have two first pressings, and I have basically one that looks like it was probably a promo copy. It's hard to really tell for sure, but this is basically, again, a first pressing. This is a Winchester pressing, and I'll tell you why that makes a difference here soon. But this one actually has submission added on as a sticker later, and I'll tell you the significance of that in a second. And then I also have a Jacksonville first pressing as well. And if you look on this one, there is no sticker and they did not have submission printed on the early jackets, so it was added later. And so the thing that was very surprising that I'm going to give away a little bit early on here is that there was a difference between the two first pressings, and a lot of this I'm sure has to do with, how they were cut, because they were definitely different cuts of the record based on the pressing plants. It looks like they were cut at, is what it appears to be. And so there's that. So the next thing I want to do is I want to go over how I typically go through this process of doing a sound quality shootout. Basically, what I do is I listen to the whole new reissue that comes out all the way through, kind of get a sense for what it sounds like, see if there's a specific song that jumps out to me that is going to be the best song to listen to for a sound quality shootout, because I typically try to find one, maybe two songs that are going to be good to do a quick A-B comparison to, as you can't really listen to a whole side of a record or a whole album and then compare it to the whole album for the one you're comparing it to. So in this particular case, I just chose the first song, Holidays in the Sun. It was a good song. It was nothing really stood out on this album in terms of, a song that would really necessarily show off the major differences between them any more than the other ones. So I picked an easy one because it's a first track on a side, so I can quickly go back and forth between them. What I also do before I start doing the A-B comparisons is I do a level match and try to make sure that all of the records, when I play them back, are at a very similar volume. I try to keep it within about a half of a decibel between of one another. And what this does is it helps assure that there is not going to be any kind of favoritism between the tracks, just because science proves that if you play a track louder, or it is louder than another track, or let's say it's the same track, but you play one louder than the other, you tend to favor the louder track as being clearer or sound better. So I try to keep it at as close to the same volume level as possible. So that being said, I went through, listened to the Rhino High Fidelity, and right off the bat I thought it sounded really good. It kind of had that typical Kevin Gray mastering for all these Rhino High Fidelities, which is kind of a little bit of a warmth to it, nice good clarity to it, and just sounds like a good quality cutting and mastering of it. Had good bass, had good treble, and I didn't think either one of them were over the top on this, so it was a good, nice balance in my opinion. Then I put on, I don't remember which one, but I put on one of the other ones. I believe I tried the Winchester pressing. And what I found right away on that is that there definitely was not quite as much bass and certainly not as much treble. That was right off the bat that I noticed right away. Is the treble definitely was not as prominent. It was definitely a mid-range heavy pressing and mastering, I should say, of it, but still sounded pretty good. And I would say the sound stage was very similar between that and the Rhino High Fidelity. And then I tried the Jacksonville pressing. And the one thing that struck me about the Jacksonville, and I should say the Winchester pressing was actually cut louder. Not by much, but a little bit louder. And actually the Jacksonville pressing and the Rhino were both cut at nearly identical volume levels. So the one thing I noticed with the Jacksonville compared to the Winchester is, besides the fact that they were cut differently at different volume levels, the Jacksonville was cut and it had a little bit more bass than the Winchester, and that might make some sense as to the reasoning for that being that, maybe because the Winchester was cut louder, they had to kind of reduce the bass a little bit more just to help with that volume level. So that's only an assumption on my part, but it's an educated guess as to why there may have been less bass on the Winchester, but there was clearly more bass on the Jacksonville. Still not quite as much bass or quite as much warmth in the recording as the Rhino, and both the Winchester and the Jacksonville seem to have about the same treble. Both really kind of lacked that treble, and it really, I think it adds a bit of excitement, along with the better bass, or more bass, I should say, on the Rhino High Fidelity. That was the one thing that really stuck out to me when I kind of compared them, is that there's, that added, excitement to the track that you really just don't get when you play back those other two. It's still there, but it just adds a little bit more to it, a little bit a higher layer of excitement to it. So the Rhino High Fidelity definitely was a quieter pressing, but that's to be expected. I would have to say, though, at least the Jacksonville one was a little bit quieter than the Winchester, but I think that just has to do with, the condition of the record and the playback and, whatnot on those. So I would say that, that's not indicative, I don't think, of a Jacksonville versus a Winchester pressing or anything like that, at least that I feel. So bottom line here is there's definitely, in my opinion, an improvement on the Rhino High Fidelity versus the earlier pressings. But if you're going to get an earlier pressing, I'd be very curious about some of the other pressings from the different pressing plants in the country. Would really love to hear an original UK, which I do not have, sadly. But if you're talking about US pressings, at least of the two first pressings I have, the Jacksonville is definitely the better of the two. But the Rhino High Fidelity just adds that little extra treble to it, which really makes, in my opinion, a big difference, and then a little bit more bass. And that just really adds to it. I think it makes it a little bit more neutral sounding, because the one thing that I've definitely noticed about this album is that it was always very mid-range heavy, and I can see why, because that's definitely where the guitars are, and that's kind of where you really want that edge to be, is in the mid-range. But I just really think it adds another layer of excitement to it, by, like I've mentioned several times, by adding that extra bass and that extra treble. So that's everything I've got on this one. My preference definitely is going to be the Rhino High Fidelity. I think you should grab yourself a copy if you don't have one, but I would really love to hear other people's takes, and I'd really especially like to hear anyone's take if they have an original UK pressing and have been able to compare it to the Rhino High Fidelity, or compare it to the first US pressings, because I'd be very curious to see what the thoughts are between those, because generally speaking, the country of origin of these recordings is typically the better sounding, and I believe that this was originally recorded in the UK, if I'm not mistaken, but you can correct me if I'm wrong on that also. So, I mean, every indication to me indicates that the Rhino used an original UK. Well, it's kind of confusing, and I should back up on that. They show a picture of the master tapes in the Rhino High Fidelities, and I'm trying to open this up so I can show you what I'm talking about as I'm talking. And they show a copy of them, and the copy, and this does not indicate that it's a copy at all. there's zero indication whatsoever that this is a copy on this. But if you also look, it says, the address is Warner Brothers in Hollywood, California, and it's Warner Brothers Records. And I don't remember, and maybe people can tell me, and I can look it up, I suppose. I just didn't think to look it up before this, but I don't believe that this was released on Warner Brothers in the UK, but people can correct me if I'm wrong. And hey, maybe this was recorded in the US. Maybe some people have a little more information on it than that. But regardless, I'd be very curious to know a little bit more about the origins of the master, because this doesn't say it's a copy. It definitely says it's the master, and it looks like it's the non-EQ'd master that they used. So I don't know, that's kind of my take, and I'd love to hear what you have to say about it. So I want to thank everybody for watching the video. If you liked what you saw, hit that like button. I want to thank my subscribers. If you're not a subscriber, I'd love to see you subscribe to my channel. Love to see new subscribers, and make some comments below. I'd love to hear your take on this and see what you think about this album and the different versions that are out there. So that's everything I have for this week. I want to thank you very much for watching. I want you to have yourself a good rest of the day and a good rest of the week. Thanks a lot.